Good morning from Portland, Oregon, everyone. My name is Corey Routh, and I have been in human resources as an executive for over 30 years. And I've also been a consultant helping organizations perform better through people strategy and people programs. And I have a specialization in neurodiversity, which is why I'm here today. In my presentation, I'll be talking about autism in the workplace and the struggles that people with autism have and how we can help people with autism under the Americans with Disabilities Act, how to go about doing that, working with employers in their HR departments. And then we'll also be talking about how we can advocate, all of us advocate that employers do more to support people with neurodiversity. So let's get started. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. All right. So let's jump in. So what we know is that people with autism struggle in all aspects of their lives, and that definitely applies to work. Most people with autism fear stigmatization, marginalization, stereotypes, discrimination, and because of these fears, they often don't disclose their condition. And they also, some of them may mask their symptoms, which is not healthy psychologically. And when people are in a state of fear and they're not disclosing, that is going to prevent them from getting the assistance that they need, certainly under the Americans with Disabilities Act. All of this can lead to anxiety and depression, which is very common among people with autism. And that can lead to more serious mental and physical health issues. Now, what we also know through research and the tremendous work that a handful of best practice employers are doing is that organizations, when they properly support people with neurodistinctions such as autism, that it actually improves organizational performance. Neurodiverse individuals such as people with autism are often 30 to 140% more productive, and people with neurodistinctions come with exceptionally high levels of valuable skills. For example, people with autism typically outperform their neurotypical peers in jobs like these: cybersecurity, intelligence engineering, analytics, statistics, accounting, and so forth. So how do we get somebody from struggling and working in fear to being properly supported and successful and feeling successful and healthy? Well, it starts with the basics, which include getting accommodations and protections under the Federal Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, I'm going to be making reference to American laws and agencies, and I just want to point out that whatever country you're in, if you're in a developed country, more than likely there are similar agencies and laws in place. So I'll be using the terminology for United States, but policies and programs and laws, but more than likely this applies in your country if you're not in the United States. So most employers must comply with the Americans with Disabilities Act. We'll talk about who that applies to and who it doesn't, but most employers must comply with that. And the Americans with Disabilities Act requires that these employers do not discriminate against people with disabilities and that they provide necessary accommodations. Now, most people, and I would say probably all people with autism, meet the definition of a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, employers' human resources departments, they're typically the gateway and the point of contact for getting these protections and this assistance. And understanding how to work with human resources departments can be really helpful in getting those accommodations. So let's take a little bit closer look at what the ADA provides. So the Americans with Disabilities Act requires that employers do not discriminate in any aspect of employment, such as the ones listed here: recruitment and placement, pay, hiring, firing, leaves, promotions, job assignments, layoffs, benefits, communication. So employers that fall under the ADA, which is employers that employ 15 or more employees, must make sure that they are not discriminating in any way, intentionally or unintentionally, in any aspect of employment. Now, employers are also required to provide reasonable accommodations, and we'll talk a little bit more about reasonability in a moment, but that includes most accommodations that somebody might request who has autism. These accommodations might include things like modifying an interview process or acquiring and modifying equipment or devices that can help somebody actually perform their duties, reassignment to a vacant position, moving from full-time to part-time, or modifying examinations or training materials, or even policies sometimes. So the accommodations are typically reasonable and are usually granted. So that means that people with autism in the workplace working for an employer with 15 or more employees must receive these protections and these accommodation benefits. Now, let's talk a little bit about the limitations and some requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act that are important to know. One is, it doesn't apply, as I mentioned, to employers with fewer than 15 employees. I would say the majority of people with autism are employed with employers with 15 or more employees, and so the ADA would apply. Also, employers may ask for reasonable documentation if a disability is not already known or obvious. Now, it's my experience then that when somebody with autism self-discloses and asks for accommodations because of their autism, that employers will not require documentation, but they may. It is their right to require documentation under the ADA. So that is something to know that might be requested. And then, as I mentioned, accommodation requests must be reasonable. And this part of the law means that people with disabilities that are requiring an accommodation must take a reasonable approach. Their request for accommodation may not include things like choosing a different manager or redesigning the essential duties of their jobs. There are limitations to those, but for the most part, I have never come across somebody with autism who has made an accommodation request that was not reasonable. So more than likely, the accommodation that you need is probably reasonable. And then the last point here is that the accommodations process must be interactive. And what that means is somebody with a disability can't go to their employer and give them a grocery list of accommodations and just expect them to fill that list. It has to be an interactive conversation, it has to be a negotiation, and there has to be agreement on what those accommodations can be. So there has to be an interactive dialogue as part of the process. Okay, so let's take a look at the accommodations interactive process from the perspective of the employer or the Human Resources Department. And there are 6 key steps. The first step is to recognize an accommodation request. And this is really important to know. There are no special words or phrases that somebody needs to utter in order to get an accommodation. So for example, although it's best to be clear, it isn't required that somebody invokes the Americans with Disabilities Act and quote that they want to engage in the accommodations process. It can be as simple as somebody with a known disability saying, hey, listen, going to the manager and saying, hey, listen, I'm really struggling with this task. Can I get some help with this? That actually is enough to activate protections under the ADA for accommodations. So the employer is responsible for making sure that their human resources professionals and the managers can identify and recognize an accommodations request. Step 2 is the employer must, once they become aware of a request, they must gather information about the limitations the person has, how those limitations affect their performing their essential duties. And then step 3 is they're required to explore accommodation options with the employee. And that's the interactive dialogue. That's where you discuss the possible accommodations and hopefully come to an agreement, which is step 4, and that is choosing an accommodation. Now, steps 1 through 4 might take place in one conversation. And if the employee is prepared and they know how to work with the Human Resources Department, it often is just one conversation, but it might be 2 or 3, depending on the circumstances. Now, step 5 is implementing the accommodation. That might be instantaneous. That might be if it's something that's really easy to roll out. If it's a change to maybe how a manager communicates with their employee, it can be right away. Oftentimes, accommodations, if any arrangements or organization or coordination is necessary, it can take a couple of weeks. Sometimes it can take a month or two if, for example, equipment that's needed is on back order and you have to wait for that to arrive. But it's incumbent upon the employer to implement that accommodation as quickly as is reasonably possible. And then the sixth step that is required of an employer is to monitor the accommodation and make sure that that accommodation is maintained and effective. Now, I'll tell you, of all these steps, the two steps that I think employers struggle with or fail at is, number one, recognizing an accommodation request, which is why we're gonna talk about how to engage HR departments in a way that is clear and direct so that that step isn't missed. And then step number 6 is where I think most employers fail, and that is actually making sure that those accommodations do work and that they are maintained properly. Now, for example, if an employee receives an accommodation and that accommodation isn't working out properly, it is the employer's responsibility to go through the whole process again, to explore accommodation options until one is found that is both reasonable and effective. So, because step 6 doesn't often happen as it should, I recommend that employees who are receiving an accommodation are actively communicating with the point person who's responsible for accommodations to let them know how it's going, and if it's not working, that they need to come up with another option. Okay, so that's the process through the lens of human resources. Let's talk about how you can prepare yourself as somebody with autism to engage in the accommodations interactive process. Now, the first item that I have here is to be ready to self-disclose. And if you haven't self-disclosed at work, this can be kind of scary, but the good news is, John Bruno mentioned in the presentation just before this, that there is a much greater understanding, acceptance, and willingness to support and understand autism than ever before. That's not necessarily true in every organization, but I think it's true for most organizations. And there are ways that you can self-disclose that will help you feel more comfortable with it. And I'm going to actually role play what this conversation can sound like and be like, and you'll see how that might, how you can make that a little bit easier on yourself. So be ready to self-disclose. And then before you have the meeting, you should think carefully about what specific limitations you have that are affecting your ability to perform the essential duties of your job. So what exactly are those limitations, and how are you going to describe those to your accommodations point person? The other thing I would do is, if you don't have a copy of your job description, get one from your manager or somebody in human resources. Usually the person that's responsible for compensation or recruiting can give you one, or your employee relations representative. But get a copy of your description and look at each of your responsibilities, your duties, and think about how your limitations are affecting your ability specifically in performing those duties. And then the next piece is to think about and maybe do some research on what accommodations might be most helpful. Now, more than likely, if you do a Google search on the struggles that you're having performing your duty, you will find that there are accommodations that people have already thought of that you can put on your list as accommodations that you might request. So you want to go into your meeting being able to be specific and clear about your limitations, how that is affecting your ability to perform your job duties successfully, and have some recommendations for accommodations. And then finally, what you want to do is to identify the right person to speak with. And the reason I mention this is because if you start with the wrong person, a couple things might happen. You might end up self-disclosing to people who don't need to know if you start with the wrong person. You might need to repeat this conversation multiple times. So we're going to talk about how to find the right person and how to work with Human Resources Department properly here in just a moment. So those are the steps that I would encourage everyone to do to prepare to engage in the accommodations interactive process. So human resources departments are designed and set up in many different ways, but almost all HR departments have all of these functions here. Now, the two on the right, employee relations and benefits and leaves, are the two that are most likely to be responsible for the accommodations process. And I would say that probably 90% of the time, it's the benefits department. So what I would recommend is that when you are trying to identify who the right person is, I would reach out to the benefits manager or somebody on the benefits team and just ask them who is responsible for providing or handling accommodation requests, and they can point you in the right direction. So it could be either of those departments. Most companies have employee relations representatives who are responsible for supporting each, the different areas within the organization. So you might know who your employee relations person is. It is certainly okay to go to them and say, hey, who is responsible for handling accommodations requests? They may say that they are, or they may point you to the right person in benefits, but either of those areas within HR are a good place to start. Now, I also want to mention that there are a couple other areas in HR where you might want to request an accommodation directly with them about the work that they do. And let's talk about, it's recruiting and training. Let's talk about recruiting first. Now, I would say one of the areas where most employers are not thoughtful about proactively providing accommodations is in the interviewing and recruiting process for external candidates and internal candidates. It's just a sort of a lagging area. So if you are going to engage in an interview and selection process, whether you are an external candidate or an internal candidate, you can go to that recruiter or the recruiting manager and say, I would like to request accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And what I would like is to only have one-on-one interviews and not group interviews, for example. Or you might say, I would like to get the questions in advance so that I can be properly prepared and able to provide responses to those questions or any other reasonable request. Similarly, if you are going to be attending a training course that the company or the organization provides, you can go to the trainer, the training manager, and say, hey, listen, I'm going to be in this class. I would like to request the following accommodations under ADA. I would like to sit in the front of the room or the back of the room, or I would like an interpreter, or I would like an audio assistance device, whatever it is that you need. Learning and development or training folks are typically more attuned to accommodations, and they should be pretty responsive. Recruiting, like I said, they might be a little less attuned to making those accommodations, but I would encourage you to make those accommodation requests when necessary, because being properly considered for placement in a job is one of the biggest obstacles that people with autism have. So I really encourage you to not hesitate to ask for the accommodations that you have there. And then, and learning development is important. Getting the proper training is important for our development, so don't hesitate there. Now, I want to mention that it's important when you're having these conversations that you make it clear that you can perform the essential duties of the job in question with or without accommodations. In this case, you're asking for accommodations. So what you're saying is, hey, I can perform these essential duties with accommodations, and that is acceptable. Okay, so with that in mind, let's, I'm going to role play what a conversation might look like with the person who is responsible for engaging in the accommodations interactive process. So as I mentioned, the first thing that you will want to do is, well, you'll want to be prepared. Get all of your, have all of your notes about your limitations, how you're struggling with your duties, and what accommodations requests you have in mind. Have those ready. Meet with the person, and then when you self-disclose, you can do it in a way that might make you feel more comfortable, such as this. You can say to the person, listen, I would like to request accommodations under the ADA. I have autism, and my autism has presents in me in a way that limits my abilities, certain abilities that affect my my ability to do certain aspects of my job. And I would like to engage in this process in a way that maintains the greatest level of privacy about my autism as possible. So I would like, however we work through this process, I would like the fewest people to know about my condition as possible. You are certainly welcome to say that. Now, I will say, if you believe that your organization is more progressive, there is advantages to self-disclosing with your manager and even your teammates, because that can help you live more authentically and to not mask your condition. But it's a choice that you need to make. But you certainly may ask to have your condition be kept as confidential as possible. It will probably be necessary that your condition is discussed with one or two other people. But because there are laws called HIPAA laws, they are required to maintain this medical information as private as they can, and is allowed while executing their responsibilities. So the first thing you say is, hey, I have autism, and my autism limits me in these ways, and then state specifically what those limitations are. And then you say, and it's affecting my ability to perform duties of my job, and these are the duties, and this is how those limitations affect me. And then you say, and these are the accommodations that I think might be helpful. Now, at that point, the person that's responsible for accommodations will probably say something like either, hey, those accommodations requests sound great to me, let's get started, let's get those in place. Or they might say, hey, we have a similar situation in another department, and their accommodation requests have been working really well. What do you think about this? Or they might say, hey, I would like to talk with somebody who specializes in this area. I'd like to have a conversation with them. Let me talk with them and circle back. Now, that conversation will probably also involve some questions from them about your limitations and your ability to perform your duties. So don't be surprised. They just want to make sure that they have all the information that they need to get the accommodation approved and in place. And then what I would do at the end of that meeting is say, thank you for your time. Thank you for considering my accommodations request. I would like to summarize what I'm taking away from this meeting. This is what we discussed. These are the decisions that we made. This is what's going to happen next. And this is the date by which that will happen. Is that correct? And then get your corrections or your verification that was all correct. And then I would also follow up with that person in an email summarizing your takeaways. That's important documentation that you might need later. So that's what a conversation can look like. And if you are prepared and you approach the conversation in that way, they will probably be very happy to engage with the process with you. It'll make it easier for them, and it will make it the entire process move more quickly. My screen is lagging here. There we go. All right, so what happens if your employer just out and out fails to provide you with a reasonable accommodation, or they discriminate against you based on your disability, either overtly or inadvertently? What do you do? What's the recourse? Well, there is accountability for employers who should be providing these protections and accommodations. And that is through the EEOC, or Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So if this happens to you, what you can do is reach out to the EEOC. You can go online and find their website. And I believe you can file a complaint online. You will still more than likely speak with an intake administrator or investigator who will have some questions for you. They will ask you for the dates and the times and what was discussed, what the employer said. So all of your notes, all of those specifics will be important if you need to file a complaint. And that's why it's really, really helpful to maintain documentation all the way through the process. So the EEOC's first approach to responding to a complaint is to try and resolve the issue. So what they will do is they will reach out to the employer once they have all the information from you, and they will say, listen, we've had a complaint. They claim that you have failed to accommodate a reasonable request under the ADA, and they will try to resolve it with the employer. And I will tell you that probably 98% of the time, issues get resolved right at this juncture. Now, it might be that the employer fails to respond, or they disagree that maybe they didn't understand what their duties were, and they are not interested in resolving the issue. If that's the case, or if they discriminated against you in an overt and significant way that is not easily resolvable, then the EEOC can take this to trial, and they can award lost wages. They can make an award for pain and suffering, and they can even award punitive damages to the employer if what they did was egregious. The EEOC may also choose to issue you a right to sue letter, and then you can sue the employer in federal court. Now, I say all of that. That scenario is very unusual these days. Usually employers are happy to engage in the accommodations process, and they do so effectively, except maybe steps 1 and step 6, they don't do so well yet. But it's good to know that if they don't follow through, that you can go to the EEOC. In fact, if an employer is balking at providing a reasonable accommodation, I think it's effective to say, listen, I think these accommodation requests are reasonable under the ADA, and I would prefer not to get the EEOC involved, but if we need to get this resolved, I think I'm willing to do that, but why don't we try to get this resolved between us? That will often, if they are reluctant at all, that will usually thaw their reluctance and help things move forward. I'm not a big advocate for threats, but if they truly aren't willing to go through with the process, mentioning the EEOC and your willingness to go there to get this resolved, I think will help quite a bit. And they will know that they cannot retaliate against you for going to the EEOC, because that is against the law. That's called a whistleblower violation, and they can be sued and held accountable for that. So if you go to the EEOC, they may not retaliate against you for that. Okay, that last part was pretty heavy. Like I said, 98% maybe plus of the time, employers are willing to provide reasonable accommodations, and going to the EEOC is not necessary. But it's good to know that that's available. Okay. So everything we've talked about to this point is getting the essential support that people with autism need in the workplace under the ADA, which is really important in helping people not only be more successful in their job, but to feel successful, and maybe even self-disclose so that they can live a more authentic and healthy work life. All of that is very important, but there is much more that can be done in the workplace, and there are some really great companies that are doing much more to support their neurodiverse population. And so the next couple of slides are about what we can all do to advocate that employers do more for their neurodiverse employees. And by the way, the last couple of years, there has been a surge of interest in neurodiversity by employees and employers. And a lot of organizations have already started to implement some of these measures to some degree, but there is a lot more work that can be done. This first slide, when I'm working with an employer on their on supporting their neurodiverse population, these are recommendations that I make to every employer. I think this is sort of like the low bar of what they should do to support their neurodiverse population. The next slide is what they can do to really fully leverage and utilize and fully support people with autism and other forms of neurodiversity, and also increase their organizational performance the most. So let's start with this sort of lower bar list. So what I recommend to employers is that they review and update their employment policies and programs, such as their DEIAB programs, to be inclusive of neurodiverse employees. That's the first place that they should start. They should provide training about neurodiversity for all of their HR team members, senior executives, and at least the managers that they know have neurodiverse team members. Then I recommend that they broadly communicate to their workforce about neurodiversity, what it is, and the organization's position in support of it. What that does is it sends a signal out to everyone that the organization understands that there are people with neurodiversity, that they recognize that, and they want everybody to understand that there are neurotypical and non-neurotypical individuals in the workforce, and that is the beginning of building awareness and understanding in the organization. So that's really important. And then the other thing that I recommend is that they implement some really basic organizational protocols that are helpful for everyone, but especially beneficial for those with neurodistinctions. And those protocols are, for every meeting, provide an agenda in advance. This allows people who are neurodiverse, and especially people with autism, be prepared, think in advance, have their questions ready, and if they need to participate in discussion, they'll be more ready. It's predictable, as John Bruno said in the last presentation. Predictability is really important for people with autism, and providing meeting agendas in advance is super helpful. Also, I recommend that they ensure that everyone in a meeting has had the chance to speak up when there is an open discussion, not just rely on people who are willing to raise their hand and speak up, because people with autism are typically less comfortable in that setting. So, for example, in a meeting, whoever's leading the meeting will go around and ask each person if they have something that they would like to add to the discussion. And then also, I recommend that they send recaps of decisions after meetings or action items, and that instructions are provided in writing, definitely to those who are neurodiverse, but it's a good practice to follow as well. So that is what I recommend for every organization to do, but I also try to get them to consider what best practice employers are doing, and there's some really great research behind these practices as well. And what I recommend as a bit of, the next step, the REACH objectives, are to engage the senior executives to build understanding, alignment, and commitment to neurodiversity. It's my experience that unless the entire senior executive team is behind something that is organization-wide, it's not going to be as successful. The next thing here is to provide neurodiversity management training to all people managers. And also, by the way, to maintain that over time. So when people are hired into management positions, that training on neurodiversity is built into required management training. The next item here is big. It is to engage, educate, inform, and update the employment population on neurodiversity over time. So instead of just in one shot announce the company's position in support of neurodiversity, it's to communicate with the entire employee base using established communication channels or training programs or employee events to reinforce and deepen the understanding of neurodiversity and what every employee can do to support their neurodiverse colleague. The next item here is to identify where in the organization people with neurodistinctions can enhance organizational performance. This is what the best practice organizations are doing that John Bruno mentioned at the end of his presentation, such as Microsoft, MasterCard, IBM, and a few others. And so they have identified roles that they know people with specific neurodistinctions can perform better, and then they instruct their recruiters or their search firms to find people with those neurodistinctions and place them in those roles. Great results have been seen with that initiative. The next item here is to create neurodiverse affinity and support groups. And then the last item I think is really helpful, and that is for employers to engage external consultants who have specialties in this areas. They can be very, very helpful. John Bruno mentioned iSocial. I am also connected with iSocial. They have a course called Professional Communication and Leadership Skills that will transform the lives of any person with autism who attends it. I went through it myself. I watched people go through it. I've talked to people who've gone through it. It is life-changing. It unlocks capabilities like no other program that I know exists. Also, there is an organization called Link OT. They have a network of occupational therapists and coaches that can help with the accommodation process, especially those that are more complicated. Really great organization. And then there's an organization called Mentra. They are a recruiting firm that specializes in finding and placing neurodiverse candidates. So utilizing external resources can be really helpful to elevate the game in neurodiversity. So what I recommend for anybody, whether you're an employee or you're an executive or you're a consultant or you're the friend of an executive, is to reach out and talk to the head of HR or a senior executive and say, hey, listen, I'd like to talk to you about how the organization can better support your population with your neurodiverse population. And you can start a conversation by saying, hey, did you know that 20% of your population is neurodiverse? Most executives don't know that. And I would like to request that we consider doing more to support that population, and then make some suggestions that are on these lists and recommend that they speak with a neurodiversity consultant like myself or somebody else. So that is all for my presentation. I would encourage you, we've got some time for some Q&A, but I would encourage you to listen to the next presentation by Judy Riley. She's going to be talking about how to build good neurodiverse programs within an organization. So it's like some of the things I mentioned here and going deeper. So I'd encourage you to attend that presentation as well. Okay, so with that, I would like to open it up for any questions if anybody has any. All right, Stephanie Toddy.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay, good. I have a question about Mentra. I found out about it during the SANS Neurodiversity Summit this year. I've signed up for it, but I work in IT, I'm in cybersecurity. All I ever get is positions around engineering work and such. Is there a bigger platform for jobs listed in Mentra? I'm just having trouble navigating, trying to figure out like other jobs beyond engineering because I don't want to be an engineer.
Yeah, you know, that's a really great question. I don't know enough about their platform to give you some advice. I will tell you that it is a very quickly developing organization. They have an incredible database. They have a really good reputation. And so what you might do is find where on their platform that you can contact them and ask them that question. I think it's a really great question.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the information about, well, Dr. Bruno said to you about iSocial, because I'm interested in the PCLS.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm there after this weekend.
Amazing. Great.
Thank you for that.
You bet.
So I discovered an Autistic like 3 years ago, and my hyper focus is now like in performing arts, and I'm doing things as an actress. And sometimes I want to disclosure that, even because I'm from Brazil. So here in Brazil, there are some political, there are some things like if you're a disabled person, you get like more funding for your film or something like that.
Okay.
But that me as an actress, sometimes I feel like really afraid to disclosure and say, okay, sometimes I'll put like my headphones when we're not recording, but when I go in front of the cameras, I will outperform. But at the same time, like, I don't think people understand that. So in this area, I'm kind of like in the shadow. I feel really afraid. Some people around me more close, they know. But like, for example, if I'm going to work with software or something, that's more acceptable. But like me trying to work, in somewhere else. Yeah.
You know, that's I am sorry you feel that way, and it's completely understandable. A lot of people feel that. I felt that way for decades, and I understand that, and it's really difficult. And I think right now, you have to really consider carefully the organization that you're disclosing to. Are there protections for you with that organization Where you are, there may not be. And also, if you can gauge their level of progressiveness, their understanding and maybe acceptance of different types of disabilities, that might help you make that decision. But only you can make that decision. And if your gut is telling you that if you don't know how well that's going to be accepted, then maybe you don't. But if you can find ways to learn more about that organization and who they are and culturally sort of what their values are, if they have a diversity program, that might help you know what to expect. But I would also be really familiar with the laws in your country to understand if you in fact have protections with that sort of organization and what those protections are. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's a very valid
general,
concern.
yeah, I have protections, but in general, like when you're doing a movie, like when you're pre-casted, you should talk in advance, like, and it's going to take like 1 month recording or something. Like it's something that would put me like maybe people wouldn't hire me if they know that.
You know, something else that you can do is do like a half step and say, hey, listen, I have found that I can work more effectively if this can happen. So for example, you know, if I can wear headphones until, you know, right beforehand, that really helps me out. So not self-disclose, but just say, hey, this happens to work good for me. You can get quite a bit. You can get quite a long ways with that approach, I think.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful.
You bet.
Thanks so much. And I'm sorry for all the microphone problems.
That's okay. Yeah. Nice to talk with you.
Thank you. Nice to talk to you too. It was lovely. Really, really good speech.
Good.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Bob Etzel made a comment that I want to respond to. It says DEIA seems to be in the news a lot and it's losing importance. Diversity programs in the last 18 months or so have been under fire from certain political groups, which is really unfortunate. And because they have proven to be very helpful for cultures, for individuals' health and state of mind, for building relationships within organization, there are a lot of benefits. And what I would say is, and I hope this is true, that attack on diversity programs will go out of focus. And I think that good employers will maintain those programs. And I think after this sort of bubble of attack passes, I think that good employers will once again lean in more fully to their diversity programs. Thanks for the question, Bob. I think this is a passing thing. You know, the focus on diversity and really understanding the individual person and supporting the individual person, you know, whatever their diversity dimension might be, or just simply as a human being, has been something that has been increasing over decades and decades, and maybe even more over more than 100 years. So I think it's a trajectory that will continue, even though we have a bit of a bubble where there's a bit, you know, some pullback because of the political landscape right now. Thanks for the question or the comment, Bob.